It has been more than 100 years since the tragic night that forever entered history ended with the sinking of the legendary liner Titanic. Even today, when most people recall that catastrophe, the stories and testimonies of those who survived that dreadful, fateful night still send chills down their spines. In the collective consciousness, there is a prevailing opinion. The main culprit of the tragedy is the collision with an iceberg. However, among the eyewitnesses, those who personally felt the full force of the catastrophe, there are accounts that point to something much more sinister and mysterious. What if these stories contain more than just a collision with an icy barrier? What if the iceberg was merely a convenient cover for a darker secret hidden behind the veil of the official version? In this video, we will delve into the deep memories of the survivors, explore various conspiracy theories, and attempt to uncover long-forgotten and hidden secrets related to the tragic end of this legendary ship. Prepare to hear a story that significantly differs from the one you are usually told. More than 6 decades have passed since that icy night of April 20th, 1912. A veteran of this terrible event, a crew member of the Titanic named Frank Pantes, struggled to hold back tears as he recounted his experiences. This man was an assistant purser, a person trained to act calmly and organized even in the most critical moments. His skills and experience were supposed to help in difficult situations, yet none of this could prepare him for the horrors he faced that night and the memories that haunted him for the rest of his life. Before we move on to the main part of our story, we would like to ask for a little support. Support in the form of attention, understanding, and perhaps some internal response will be the best reward for this story. In his recollections, he repeatedly emphasized that there was no pronounced impact or strong collision that night, as is commonly believed. In a BBC documentary released in 1979, he said, "It was like suddenly hitting the brakes in a car, and indeed the ship simply stopped. There was no deafening crash, no powerful impact, no noticeable damage. For a long time, everyone believed that the Titanic collided with the iceberg with incredible force that literally broke it in half. But for those on board, the sensations were quite different. They said there was no sharp jolt, no clanging metal, no sound of cracking ice. Everything happened very quietly, as if the ship suddenly stopped, and all that remained was the eerie and strange halt that should not have occurred." That night, the assistant purser was in his cabin. He opened the porthole and looked outside. The sky was clear without clouds, and the stars shone brightly over the calm sea. He noticed nothing unusual. No signs of impending danger, no signs of trouble. He heard no panic or alarm, and there was no visible damage to the ship's hull. Yet despite the apparent soundness and calm, the ship, considered an unsinkable marvel of engineering, suddenly stopped in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Something was clearly wrong, but no one could understand what exactly. Shortly after, the captain ordered a descent to the lower decks in preparation for evacuation. Frank Pantes was sent to fetch biscuits for the lifeboats. When he returned, he saw that the Titanic had already tilted dangerously. Chaos ensued. People rushed to the lifeboats. Panic engulfed the entire ship. Many survivors who gave their testimonies during the hearings in the United States Senate made an impression with the similarity of their accounts. They spoke of no massive collision or explosion, as one might assume given the scale of the tragedy. Instead, their testimonies recalled subtle vibrations, a quiet panic that gripped people in the final minutes, and strange, barely discernible sounds emanating from within the ship, as if something was slowly but inexorably destroying it from the inside. The question that inevitably arose among listeners: what mysterious iceberg could cause such destruction, leading to explosions within the vessel? The official explanation was that there was a rupture of steam pipes or boilers inside the ship, which were under high pressure. However, none of the witnesses could confirm this with absolute certainty, as no direct evidence or obvious damage indicating an explosion or severe external trauma was found. This lack of clear external signs of collision or explosion made the situation even more mysterious and fueled various conspiracy theories that existed and evolved over the decades. If there was no obvious collision with an iceberg, then what could have caused such destruction? Was it, for example, cheap and poorly fastened rivets or weak metal from which the ship's hull was made? Perhaps the cause was a smoldering fire flash inside the hull, which lasted several days and gradually weakened the ship's structure from within. Or maybe it was about deliberate actions, something that was carefully planned and made to appear as an accident, yet executed with precision deadly to those inside. And what about the mysterious spotlight seen from the lifeboats? The light that many saw and took for a saving beam seemed to be a signal or beacon indicating some help. But if another ship was indeed close enough to be seen, why did it not come to the rescue? Was it a missed opportunity? Or on the contrary, was this ship not intended for rescue but served as an observer or lookout? These questions conceal yet another mystery. Frank Pentis never claimed to have all the answers, but his memories and stories offer more than mere guesses. They provoke thought, raising doubts that have lingered in the cold winds of the Atlantic for a whole century. But if the iceberg was not the true cause of the tragedy, then what really happened? One of the most popular and controversial theories involves fire, deception, and the concealment of truth that persisted for decades. It begins with the assumption of the existence of a ship that wasn't actually there. This theory is considered one of the most compelling and simultaneously most controversial in maritime history. What if the ship that sank in 1912 was not the Titanic at all? In this version, known as the Olympic switch theory, it is suggested that one of the ships, which looked almost identical to the Titanic, was the liner Olympic, which was deliberately disguised as the famous vessel and then used in a complex insurance fraud scheme. This idea sounds like a wild conspiracy whispered about on forums and in documentaries. But to understand why it gained such popularity, one must look at the circumstances that led to the tragic voyage. The liner Olympic was launched a whole year before the Titanic and was very similar in design. However, in September 1911, the Olympic collided with the British warship Hawke. This incident breached the side of the Olympic and caused serious damage. While the construction of the real Titanic was still ongoing, it was nevertheless scheduled to sail under the name Olympic. The main idea of this scheme was to intentionally sink the damaged ship, blame it on an accident, and receive large insurance payouts. This version of events attracts many supporters who point to a number of alleged pieces of evidence supporting their theory. The most famous of these is related to the number of portholes located on the ship. According to the original plans of the Titanic, there were supposed to be 14 portholes on one side of the front deck, while the Olympic already had 16. When the ship set out on its maiden voyage, photographs show that it had exactly 16 portholes, just like the Olympic. This fact seems like a coincidence that proponents of the theory find suspicious, as some claim it is not accidental. Additionally, they point to differences in the ship's internal layouts, the strange behavior of the crew, and the fact that before the Titanic's maiden voyage, the ship underwent final adjustments for an entire week. Some believe that this period could have been used for the ship's swap, which would support the substitution theory. Even more suspicious for the theory's supporters is the fact that financier John D. Morgan, owner of the International Mercantile Marine Company, which controlled White Star Line, had booked a luxurious private suite on Titanic's maiden voyage. He canceled his trip at the last moment, citing poor health, but was later seen relaxing at a French resort. Why would the main organizer of the ship's construction decide to forgo the voyage unless he knew in advance that something was going to go very wrong? This mystery only heightens suspicions. However, critics of this theory quickly dismiss it. Maritime historians such as Garrett Russell and Kent Litton argue that executing a large-scale ship swap in less than 2 weeks is practically impossible. Although the two ships were very similar in appearance, they had significant differences: different internal layouts, mechanical systems, and serial numbers engraved throughout the structure. Such a swap would require a tremendous amount of work, strict secrecy, and coordinated cooperation of hundreds of workers and officers, without a single whistleblower coming forward even a century later. Moreover, another serious argument against this version is the insurance calculation. The Titanic was insured for an amount less than its construction cost. If the goal was merely to make a profit, swapping the ship would make no sense. And when the shipwreck was discovered in 1985, identifying it as the Titanic confirmed that it was indeed the ship lying at the ocean's bottom. Nevertheless, the idea of a swapped ship continues to captivate many, as it plays on our curiosity about mysteries hidden behind closed doors, our tendency to suspect and distrust the official version. It stirs the imagination, for if someone was willing to sink a ship for money, what other hidden motives might have been behind it? Could there have been a danger lurking within the Titanic itself that no one knew about? A threat that could have led to disaster long before the collision with ice or sabotage? Perhaps an invisible danger was already lurking inside this giant ship, ready to ignite at the most inopportune moment, leaving everyone defenseless and blind to the impending catastrophe. Among the many passengers aboard the Titanic was a man whose name still sparks debate among enthusiasts of the paranormal. This was William Stead, a respected British journalist and editor known for his passion for the supernatural and mystical mysteries. In those times when many people embarked on voyages by ship to seek new opportunities, experience luxury, or start life anew, there emerged a man whose story remained etched in the listener's memories as something eerie and inexplicable. This man named Stead brought aboard a ship a disturbing and grim legend, a tale of an ancient mummy attributed not only with mystical power, but also with a deadly curse. His accounts of the mysterious relic, which he confidently described as part of ancient rituals and mystical mysteries, did not sound like mere tales or fantasies. Stead sincerely believed that there was something on the ship that could harm or even destroy anyone who touched this ancient relic. And this belief took on an especially sinister tone just a few days after departure, when it became known that his assumptions might not be mere figments of imagination, but a real danger. According to this man, the object of his fear was the lid of a sarcophagus, which he claimed belonged to a high priestess from ancient Egypt. He asserted that this lid was not just part of a tomb, but an artifact unearthed in Egypt and acquired by collectors. According to legend, this very lid possessed the power to bring death and misfortune to all who dared to touch it. For a long time before the Titanic's voyage, strange and inexplicable events occurred at the British Museum, where this mysterious relic was said to be kept. Guards responsible for the security of the exhibit suddenly resigned, many of them falling ill under mysterious circumstances. Some curators, even without touching the object, became ill and died. One journalist who dared to handle the lid died under very mysterious circumstances. These incidents left no doubt among those who believed in the mystical power of the artifact. In their opinion, it was the source of chaos and disasters that engulfed London. Stead, for his part, was convinced that this mummy was not just an ancient relic, but the key to a series of misfortunes, that it somehow ended up in the museum and was the cause of all the misfortunes occurring in the city. He recounted that the artifact was sold to a wealthy American who insisted on transporting the mummy to New York to showcase it in the New World. This person, according to Stead, was sure that the cursed item had already left a trail of deaths and misfortunes, and its journey across the Atlantic was just another trial for this mysterious relic. On board the Titanic in those days, passengers listened to his stories as an exciting and mystical entertainment after dinner. None of them could have predicted that in a few days these stories would take on an entirely different meaning. When the ship struck an iceberg and began to sink, fear and terror gripped everyone, and no one thought of mystical legends anymore. Those who tried to save themselves fought for a place in the lifeboats under the grim and starry sky, shivering from the icy Atlantic wind. In just a few days, everything changed. The tragedy that befell the Titanic became one of the most horrific and well-known disasters in history. As the media began to learn about what had happened, they eagerly seized any story that could explain the events. And of course, there were mentions of the ancient mummy and its supposed curse. One of the survivors, recounting his story to a New York reporter, inadvertently sparked a wave of rumors and speculations. Soon, newspaper headlines were filled with reports about the mummy's curse and its role in the tragedy. The public, shocked by the scale of the disaster and the unimaginable loss of hundreds of lives, sought any explanation, even the most incredible, to make sense of what had happened. It was not an actual mummy artifact, but likely a funerary board that over time became a source of eerie rumors and legends. These stories took root in the public memory, thanks to a long tradition of imperial folklore and myths that seemed to be fueled over centuries. Why did so many people believe in such a mysterious and mystical story, despite the obvious facts? Perhaps the reason was that the real explanation for the tragedy, such as the collision with an iceberg, failure in safety protocols, or the captain's arrogance in believing the ship was unsinkable, seemed too mundane and ordinary to justify such a profound and devastating loss. In such circumstances, the curse of the mummy or ancient relics offered something else, something cosmic and elusive, promising retribution from above. This version suggested that the disaster was not an accident, but had deeper causes related to the violation of sacred taboos or curses imposed by age-old traditions. Within this theory, it was believed that the Titanic, a symbol of luxury, wealth, and imperial power, was punished for violating these sacred boundaries, for the pride and hubris of man who dared to call his ship unsinkable. However, despite the frightening and mystical overtones of this story, events were unfolding behind the scenes that were far more tangible and real. There was a force at work, not based on ancient curses, but on modern ambitions and a thirst for power. The next person we will discuss did not carry any relic or magical artifact. He carried influence, powerful and sometimes hidden, capable of changing the destinies of entire nations and eras. Some believe that he, using his power and influence, sought to change the course of history to affect the fate of the world. When the Titanic sank in 1912, the event ceased to be a simple maritime tragedy. For some, it became the central element of a darker and more powerful conspiracy theory, which claimed that the disaster was not accidental. In their view, it was a carefully planned and calculated move aimed at paving the way for one of the most influential financial structures in the world, the Federal Reserve System of the United States. At the center of this complex scheme stood one man, J.P. Morgan, or as he was known, John Pierpont. Morgan was not just an ordinary businessman. At the beginning of the 20th century, he became one of the most influential figures in American finance, managing an entire network of industries: steel production, rail transport, electric power, and shipping. His tight control over the country's economic flows earned him the nickname, the Napoleon of Wall Street. He also held a controlling interest in the White Star Line Company, which owned the Titanic. When the maiden voyage of this legendary ship was being prepared, Morgan reportedly reserved a luxurious suite for himself with a private promenade deck and special cigar holders. He even attended the launch of the Titanic in 1911, publicly praising the ship as a symbol of progress, luxury, and modern technology. However, to everyone's great surprise, Morgan suddenly canceled his participation at the very last moment. At the last minute, he decided to take a few days off at a spa hotel on a French resort, where he reportedly underwent long massages and sulfur baths. Many found this very strange. After all, the event was significant, and he himself was highly interested in this voyage. For conspiracy theorists, this marked the beginning of a new version linking him to this tragedy. Morgan was not the only major player connected to the fate of the Titanic. Among his opponents, who also played a role in the creation of a centralized American banking system, were three influential figures. All three individuals in question were well known for their staunch and fierce opposition to centralized banking power, which at the time was rapidly consolidating and expanding. Some historians and conspiracy theorists claim that these people had enough resources, as well as influence and connections, to either delay or completely thwart the creation of the Federal Reserve System, which was to become the main instrument of control over the national economy. In December 1913, just over a year after the tragic sinking of the Titanic, a law was passed that initiated the operation of the Federal Reserve System. This law effectively granted powerful financial elites, such as the Morgan family, as well as other influential bankers, the kind of centralized control they had long sought. For conspiracy theorists, this moment seems especially convenient. They see it as evidence of a planned scheme. They assert that the Titanic tragedy was a carefully orchestrated tool of economic assassination, with people like J.P. Morgan pulling the strings to execute their dark plans. They believe the goal was to eliminate opposition, bury any evidence at sea, in the Atlantic Ocean, and completely reshape the financial world to their liking and desire. Of course, critics and skeptics are quick to point out the flaws in this theory. There is no definitive and compelling evidence that any of the three men aboard that ill-fated vessel had the ability to stop or influence the creation of the Federal Reserve System. Similarly, there is no evidence of a direct connection between Morgan and this conspiracy. His possible changes in plans could have been due to personal reasons or the result of last-minute commitments. The idea that one of the bloodiest maritime disasters in history was deliberately staged to achieve certain goals seems excessive and unlikely to many. However, despite this, suspicions still linger. The fact that Morgan's financial empire was built on bold, often ruthless decisions only heightens these doubts. He was a man who looked to the future and was not afraid to take risky steps, including using influential people to ensure control and power. In the context of a changing global economy, where wealth was created and lost in the blink of an eye, such ideas seem quite justified. And although there is no solid evidence that J.P. Morgan and his circle could have orchestrated the sinking of the Titanic to strengthen their legacy and eliminate opposition, this theory continues to intrigue. It is like a whisper that grows louder with each new detail found and each coincidence. What if Morgan didn't need an iceberg to eliminate his enemies? What if there was no iceberg at all? In this direction, one naval expert expressed his thoughts, claiming that the cause of the Titanic's sinking was not a collision with an icy wall. He believes the true cause lies in the hidden danger, multi-million-dollar fields of pack ice that were located in the latitudes through which the ship sailed. These ice fields were vast, flat, almost without peaks, and very difficult to discern, as they resembled a calm sea covered with fog and cold air. Unlike the image of a dramatic white iceberg peak, which seems ominous and unpredictable in the dark, according to Captain Collins, these ices were invisible and hidden beneath the surface of the calm water. Captain Collins was not just a theorist. He had years of practical experience navigating the icy waters of the Arctic and Antarctic. He knew well how ice behaved in these conditions and could confidently assert that the tragedy of the Titanic might not have occurred due to a sudden iceberg collision, but because the ship was part of a specialized British service that studied sea ice and its impact on maritime vessels. This experience allowed Collins to take the first steps in investigating one of the most mysterious and controversial moments related to the Titanic's sinking. He decided to turn to the reports of survivors to understand what happened in the final hours of this giant liner's life. A careful study of these testimonies revealed a striking and very strange inconsistency. People, eyewitnesses to the events, gave such different descriptions of the iceberg that it seemed as if they were talking about two completely different objects. Some said it was tall, reaching about 60 feet in height, which would correspond to the classic image of a huge, fearsome ice giant. Others, including the fourth officer named Joseph Boxhall, claimed the iceberg was barely visible, just slightly above the water level. How could so many well-trained sailors and professional crew members see and describe the same object so differently? What was the reason for this? Collins concluded that the answer lay in a phenomenon known as superrefraction, an optical effect that can distort perception in conditions of extreme cold and low temperatures. In such conditions, the water surface is covered with a thin film of ice, and even slight changes in temperature or atmospheric conditions can cause the ice sheet on the water surface to appear much higher or, conversely, disappear from view. Sometimes it could shimmer in a strange way, creating the illusion that the object, the iceberg, was very close, although in reality it was much farther away. As a result, one person could perceive the iceberg as a huge ice mountain, while another saw it as a flat ice field, almost at water level. This theory fit well with the accounts of the crew in the area known as the Crow's Nest, the observation point on the upper deck. There they described a white haze stretched across the horizon, which Collins believed was not fog at all, but a dense veil of flat pack ice, like a minefield spread out in the Titanic's path. This ice created the sensation of an obstacle that made it difficult to accurately determine the distance to the iceberg. But the boldest and perhaps most controversial aspect of Collins' theory was his attempt to explain what happened using physical effects, particularly the Berge effect. This concept suggests that if the ship had indeed collided with a huge stationary iceberg at full speed, the displacement of water in such a collision would have caused an upward suction. According to the laws of physics, such an effect could have caused the iceberg, upon encountering this upward flow, to either overturn, split, or be displaced. Moreover, such a collision could not have ended with the ice block gently sliding along the side of the ship, remaining intact. Most importantly, if the ship had indeed hit such an iceberg at high speed, the hull rupture would have been instantaneous, and the ship would have sunk within minutes. In reality, we have evidence that the Titanic remained afloat for almost 2.5 hours after the collision before it fully submerged. This suggests that the cause of the tragedy was not a single powerful collision, but rather a chain of damages caused by multiple impacts with small ice. Collins suggested that the ship's hull was damaged in several places by pack ice, which gradually, like a knife, cut through the metal, creating a chain of small breaches. This would explain why many survivors heard scraping and scratching noises, rather than the loud crack typical of a single powerful impact. Additionally, some, like Frank Pantus, reported sounds resembling explosions or deep structural failures within the ship. On that fateful night when the Titanic collided with the icy giant, the question arises, could there have been something else within this ship that made it particularly vulnerable? Not only the icy impact caused the tragedy, but also internal damages that might have already weakened its structure long before it approached the iceberg. Inside the massive coal storage areas located in the depths of the ship, a fire raged, known from numerous accounts, which burned for several days, even before the ship left the port of Southampton. The crew, aware of its existence, tried to fight the fire using all possible means to contain the blaze. However, the question remains, what damage was inflicted on the ship while it was still burning inside? Fires in coal bunkers on steamships of that time were not uncommon. The coal used to power the engines often self-ignited under certain conditions, especially under high pressure. But the fire in question was not ordinary. According to archival data, the flames could reach such scales and temperatures that they could literally melt or weaken the ship's metal framework. Particularly dangerous was the section located on the starboard side, precisely where the collision with the iceberg later occurred. Some engineers speculate that the fire could have heated the steel so much that it became more brittle and vulnerable. As a result, even a minor collision could have led to catastrophic flooding of the ship. In an attempt to stop the spread of the fire, the stokers were dumping burning coal directly into the furnaces to extinguish the flames and simultaneously reduce the risk of further spread. The irony of fate is that these desperate measures to combat the fire might have indirectly hastened the tragedy. By increasing the fuel supply to the furnaces, they might have increased the ship's speed, despite numerous warnings about icy dangers along the route. This increase in speed could have been one of the factors contributing to the catastrophe. And if we assume that the hull structure was already weakened by the internal fire, even a minor collision with an iceberg could have been a fatal blow, turning a small crack into irreparable destruction. There is photographic evidence that supports some of these assumptions. In one of the photos taken before departure, a dark vertical stripe is clearly visible on the ship's hull, precisely where the fire was believed to have raged. Some experts believe that this area might have suffered from thermal impact. However, there are skeptics. For instance, renowned Titanic historian Samuel Halpern has publicly rejected the idea that the fire could have significantly damaged the ship's structure. He argues that the watertight compartments remained intact and that the ship was capable of withstanding localized thermal damage. In his opinion, the cause of the sinking was the collision with the iceberg, not the internal fire. Nevertheless, doubts persist. The timing and location coincide, and the ship's behavior that night, its speed, unusual noises, strange system failures, all raise questions. Was the Titanic doomed not only by the forces of nature, but also by internal damage it inflicted upon itself? Could a fire hidden within the hull have been a silent killer, setting the stage for tragedy? And finally, a metaphorical question arises. Was it a symbol that danger hidden within is often more destructive than external blows? Perhaps the real fire raged within the engine room, engulfing it in a fiery force that could consume everything in its path. Yet in the higher echelons of the human mind, in those who guided the fate of the ship, another more concealed and powerful fire burned. It was the fervor of ambition, pride, and the desire to prove to the world that engineering had conquered nature, that humanity had finally overcome its power. This internal fire demanded swift decisions, the necessity to move forward without delay, despite all dangers. Time was limited, and it was necessary to showcase to the world the splendor of modern technology, luxury, and innovative achievements in the shortest possible time. This fervor, like the initial fire, also spiraled out of control and ultimately could have been just as deadly and destructive. The responsibility for what happened is often placed on the iceberg, as it was the immediate cause of the tragedy. But what if this iceberg was merely the final point in a chain of events that began much earlier? Perhaps it was only the finishing touch, the culmination of a fire that had long been smoldering in the depths of human ambition and error. The grandeur of the Titanic is not only in the massive steel, rivets, and colossal structures from which it was assembled. It is also in the emotions, mysteries, memories, and feelings associated with this ship. The question is, was the Titanic's fate truly decided by the iceberg, or was its appearance merely part of a much more complex and multifaceted story? Perhaps there was sabotage, arson, substitution, or something more sinister and dangerous. What do you think about this? What do you believe the truth is? We would be delighted to hear your thoughts in the comments. If this deep and challenging topic has made you question what you previously considered obvious, be sure to acknowledge it by giving a like and subscribing so you don't miss new materials. Also, don't forget to activate notifications to always stay updated with the latest news and fresh releases. Thank you to everyone who watched this story to the end. Your support, your like, and your subscription are very important to us as they inspire us to create new and interesting content.